Finnegans Wake is an invigorating text to read, but it can often be an interpretive nightmare because there are so many fundamental questions which are brought to the fore when reading Finnegans Wake that are really only implicitly there in other texts. Things like, is there a plot? How does time work? How does history work? Are there characters? These are the sort of things that are explicated in 4 of the essays taken from this collection of critical essays on Finnegans Wake, which I would like to explicate for you here. I think these essays provide some really good things to hold on to when reading Finnegans Wake, because I've noticed that in terms of online content on Finnegans Wake, it's fairly disparate. And when it's there, it's giving very general introductions, which are helpful. But as you're working your way through Finnegans Wake, it's the text that you kind of have to read before you understand it. Obviously that's the case for every text, but it's even more so for Finnegans Wake because it's so idiosyncratic in its form, in its expression, in the way that it uses language. It's definitely a very singular aesthetic edifice, and I think that it's something that needs to be wrestled with the help of some very solid scholarship. First, we have Clive Hart's Finnegans Wake in Adjusted Perspective. Now, I've become familiar with Clive Hart because he's a very central scholar in Joyce scholarship, and specifically in Finnegans Wake scholarship. And this is a really nice essay because he presents a couple of common misconceptions or assertions about Finnegans Wake, and then he kind of undermines them a bit. For example, he mentions that often it's assumed that he used theories that bolstered an all-consuming superstition, that everything is mythic and archetypal in its nature, and I think oftentimes this is greatly over-exaggerated, especially with regards to psychoanalysis. There's obviously themes of incest in Finnegans Wake, and this can make especially the Freudians kind of perk up. But I think it's very clear that at best, Joyce was skeptical of psychoanalysis. He was extremely skeptical of any one narrative to be able to overwrite or fully embody a conception of the universe. He's therefore playing on the style of someone like Nietzsche, who employs a perspectival way of using language, where meaning and truth are constructed from a series of perspectives which, instead of being able to be dialectically resolved like someone like Hegel or Marx would think with history, instead they just kind of bustle about together without necessarily resolving, but there is some meaning that can be gleaned from the exchanging of those perspectives, from the friction between them, but without the friction merely being a negative friction, as it is in someone like Hegel, where dialectical movement occurs by the process of sublation, by which contradictions are resolved. They are also done away with, but also carried on. This is the somewhat paradoxical nature of the German Aufgeben or Aufhebung. And Joyce chooses to focus more, as someone like Nietzsche would, on the positive aspects of friction, not solely insofar as they are just a stepping stone, but insofar as this friction itself, this inability to understand, this working through and mulling something over, is itself constitutive of the meaning. Hart says, Joyce used language in ways which would work fully for the reader only if certain irrational concepts about the function of words were true. And I might note here that when he uses the word irrational, it might be more accurate to say non-rational. It's not so much, because irrational has a negative connotation, but Joyce just as Nietzsche is doing, is trying to break out of this Enlightenment, rationality-centered ethos for how do we go about creating texts, about finding meaning, about moving through history and discovering what's true. His belief in the magical function of language is thoroughly well attested. He told Heinrich Straumann that the reader should let the linguistic phenomenon affect one as such, which he seems to have implied that communication of some sort will take place even when the meanings of words, in the normal sense of meaning, are not consciously apprehended. There is some truth to Beckett's assertion that Joyce used words as things, that he subscribed to ideas of a racial linguistic unconscious. If the reader is to follow the lead that he often finds in the biographies, he will allow the phenomenon of Finnegans Wake to work on him without rational intervention. He will expect unknown words to stir him, just as he may be stirred by the sight of unknown objects of mysterious natures or archetypical forms. And this is a great challenge with reading Finnegans Wake, is that it pulls you two ways. At the one hand, it's well known that it's not a traditional reading experience and that you should alter your expectations as such. I mentioned this in my very in-depth guide to Finnegans Wake, which you can check out. But at the other hand, it also appears as a challenge that you want to solve. It's like the ultimate puzzle, and when you unlock it, there are some scholars who will say that this has all the history of the human race in it. It predicts the future, it predicts the atomic bomb or stuff like this. And, these are very interesting, but I think more so, and we'll see this as we get into some of the more interpretive essays with regards to language and things like the portmanteau word, a lot of this is just the result of the fact that it's so hermeneutically open in Finnegans Wake, because language is taken to its absolute limit where it's not free associative. It's actually very expertly crafted in a thoroughly modernist style where great attention is paid to detail. And yet in so doing, we are getting a linguistics which thrives on the multiplicity of associations inherent in every word. And as such, meaning is something that affects us in a bodily way. It's not just something that we rationally apprehend as a representation, but it is also, as Heidegger would say, pre-ontological. It depends on being absorbed in the sort of social milieu of being aware of the historical events that Joyce is going to be aware of and things like this, and using this to be aware of, okay, there are certain Jungian archetypes which exist and have been theorized about. And these will probably inform Joyce's writing, just as something like the Oedipus complex will, for example. But I think it's important that we hold on to that tenet of perspectival writing, which is that we don't focus on the resolution of these perspectives, but we focus on the knowledge which can be gained from their friction. He continues, Joyce is looked upon as the exponent of destruction, the prophet of the modern social crack-up. Finnegans Wake reflects the crack-up directly. Joyce wrote the book to express the dissolution of the universe, and hence the association of materials in the portmanteau words is by intention self-contradictory, self-destructive, fortuitous, based on unreason. A grandiose agglomeration of disparate materials has been produced by free associative methods. Thus, although the reader may here and there glean some local sense by a similar process of associative reading, it is futile to try to derive any coherent statement from the book as a whole. That's important. There is no one statement which is trying to be uttered from the book. In fact, it's a celebration of the variety of perspectives. There are genuinely different people in Finnegans Wake. Because, for example, in Ulysses, Joyce mentioned that as we go through the world, we are seeing through ourselves, and we are constantly running into ourselves over and over again. There's a curious dialectic within Finnegans Wake, which is that we are both running into the self that is the human race, which is supposedly some essential thing, something that we can hold and say truth claims about. But at the same time, it celebrates the dissolution of that abstraction itself, celebrates the evocative capacity of language to not resolve itself into stability. As such, it does celebrate the crack-up in many ways. It celebrates the ability to contradict oneself. As Walt Whitman said, "Do I contradict myself? So I do." That's exactly what Joyce is saying. And when Hart mentions this free associative method, it's important that Joyce is merely trying to emulate the sort of dream-free association. But I feel very strongly that Joyce is well within the modernist tradition, focusing on ideally the perfect aesthetic evocation through extreme attention to detail, and not necessarily realism, because Finnegans Wake is about as far from realism as you can get. You're not trying to get past images and shadows, as Plato would say in the allegory of the cave, and get to the light of truth as such outside the cave. No. First off, that would just lead to an infinite regress of doubting. But second of all, Joyce is privileging shadows, the uncanny, right? Even Freud talks about the unheimlich, the uncanny. Now, Hart mentions an important hermeneutic question, which is extremely pertinent in Finnegans Wake and one of the most difficult things about reading and interpreting the text. To what system or systems of reference should the black marks on the page be referred? This is the great question. How does signifier relate to signified? Is there one signified or are there many? And if this is the case, are there a hierarchy of signifieds such that some are more authentically linked to the signifier than others? How do we determine that? Do we have a systematic framework by which to reach such conclusion, or is it just open season? We are used to literature which displays a multiplicity of meanings, Hart says, but we are used also to a publicly apprehendable surface. Mary Had a Little Lamb may be a political allegory, but it is also for the uninitiated a simple, comprehensible narrative. Finnegans Wake often contains such a surface meaning, but equally often it does not. That's the important thing. Finnegans Wake betrays depth from its very first page. It's almost impossible to find a coherent surface meaning throughout the text. Only rarely do you get these moments where the text just plainly shows itself. The language will kind of ebb and flow, where it will approach or distance itself from normal English spelling and conventions. So sometimes you'll have these moments where, for example, we have ALP's letter, which is supposed to exonerate HCE, which is near the end of Finnegans Wake. That's a fairly lucid section. There are other fairly lucid sections, such as the sexual encounter between ALP and HCE, as well as the moment when they're woken up by their crying child. There are small moments where the text doesn't immediately betray that impenetrable depth. But oftentimes, there is no immediately comprehensible surface. We can kind of glean various meanings, and, especially people who are bi or multilingual, they'll be able to make all these connections, which people who are firmly situated in just English may not be able to make. So we're all kind of trying to vie for our own interpretive schemas, but ultimately, the real question is, what type of schema are we allowed to use? Now, Hart mentions 4 different schemas that he can think of when it comes to interpreting Finnegans Wake, and by extension any other text. The first, he says, is that we may retain the agreement where the black marks on the page are, as in the first example above, identical with the conventional signs for English words and phrases. Approximations to such signs may be interpreted in the same way as one interprets, for example, the everyday pun. So in this first way, we're trying to basically round off all the edges with English as best we can. It's supposed to be English, but it's supposed to be a distorted English, but the kernel is supposed to be English. That's the first idea. Now, the second schema is that we may assume that Finnegans Wake is an amalgam of typographical bits and pieces drawn from various accepted systems, each bit to be interpreted in terms of the system from which it appears to have been drawn. The contexts in question include, of course, not only natural languages, but also such things as proper names and the specialist vocabulary of any intellectual discipline. So here, we're not approximating everything to one single schema, which is that of English, but it is a sort of solar system of interrelated schemas, hierarchically related. So we've got English, and then kind of fanning out, we have different sort of specialist vocabularies, such as the natural sciences, or psychoanalysis, or Jungian archetypes, or epic poetry. We have these sort of paradigms which in different instances are going to act as the most effective interpretive schema, but the idea is, in this second method, that everything can roughly be identified to a schema that's already pre-existing, right? It's just a matter of figuring out which stable schema is that. Now, the third type is quite interesting, and certainly one that often seems compelling for Finnegans Wake, but has its own problems, or at least caveats, that Hart wants to mention. Hart's essay, it must be said, is fairly privy to this third method, and is probably the most liberal, interpretively speaking. He says, we may expand number 2 and assume that any sign or symbol in Finnegans Wake may be interpreted according to any agreed upon linguistic or other system, with one of whose signs or symbols it is identical, or to which it approximates. For example, the form see, as in S-E-E, might be interpreted at all times as English, see, as in to see, and or the German See, as in the sea or the lake. So this is a much more wide interpretive schema, where if it fits and you want to use it and it will add a step, then it's allowed. It might use some sort of very foreign schema, but nevertheless, if it can be interpreted, it can be interpreted that way. Now, whether or not it's good or not is going to depend upon a number of considerations about, things like consistency, for example, right? And then the fourth one is that it may be assumed that Finnegans Wake is based on no agreed upon system or systems, but that in keeping with some of Joyce's apparent beliefs about the function of language, its words should be thought of as having an irrational, mysterious, incantatory, or magical effect on the psyche. Receptivity rather than analysis would then be the basis of reading. And this fourth schema is also rather interesting because this is the purely affective realm of Joyce's writing. This is where you're solely focused on, as he says, things like onomatopoeia and totem words. You're focusing on what are the exact affects, emotions, and feelings that are being created by these words, by the way that they interrelate together. What is the imagery being formed in my head that is beyond any rational schema that is pre-existing? This is the most creative of the schemas, in the literal sense of you are actively creating a new schema as you're going along. Because in a lot of these other methods, we've got an interpretation as a whole entity consisting of a bunch of different schemas which are kind of held in confluence. But with this one, we are creating those schemas almost ex nihilo, not really ex nihilo because nothing is really ex nihilo, we don't exist in a vacuum. But nevertheless, this is the most abstract level of interpretation when it comes to Finnegans Wake. And it can be useful because, for example, Coxitoiska is a word that Hart uses, which he's taking from Finnegans Wake, and he uses this as an example of such an onomatopoeic word or a totem word. He says, Joyce wants the various overtones of meaning which arise when we relate the word form to the English language. That is to say, we are asked to supply pun materials which seem relevant to a foreign word which is used in an English context. So, of course, because English is Joyce's kind of main language, even though he knew so many, he wrote all of his stuff in English, and Wakey's, the language of the Wake, is seen as a sort of dialectically inflected and inflated English by most scholars. And as such, it's assumed that most readers who approach Finnegans Wake, if they're adept in any language, it's probably going to be English. I mean, the intelligibility of Finnegans Wake to someone who knows no English but knows a lot of German or a lot of Italian. I mean, maybe they're like a PhD in German or Italian literature. The intelligibility of Finnegans Wake will be really, really, really low, way less than an English speaker in an equivalent position. So as such, Joyce does expect or predict that his readers are probably going to be filtering all of this through an English paradigm. And as such, we are to supply the meanings where the structure is sort of suffused, where holes open up and it becomes like a sieve that we have to fill with meaning. And with regards to this third technique, the one where any schema works if it works, basically. This is the most laissez-faire of the different schemas. He responds to some critics of this, and he says that potentially any meaning drawn from any linguistic system may be accepted. In practice, of course, the limits are more restricted since only those meanings are accepted which provide a coherent set of conceptual interrelationships. The coherence is, however, potentially limitless. Joyce, the master craftsman, made Finnegans Wake so brilliantly and so inclusively that it is about anything that ever happened anywhere. Thus, any reading is true provided it has some meaningful link with some other idea in the context. The network of relationships may lead in any direction, though some relationships will be more immediate than others and may have more appeal to the individual explicator. And he says that this has its pros and cons because in some way this is the most de-hierarchized way of approaching hermeneutics, where it doesn't matter how many steps it takes to reach something, as long as it can be coherently fit into a paradigm, then Occam's razor is basically out the window. He says that this is a possible way that many scholars have gone about interpreting Finnegans Wake, where as long as you can show your steps, then it doesn't matter the complexity, it just matters that this can be recognized amongst its parts and it has coherence as its criterion. But he mentions that there are some absurdities that can be reached with this perspective, and as such, he's going to go away from this laissez-faire perspective a little bit and tone it down and make it more pragmatist. He explicitly says that he wants to make it pragmatist. He says we need to remind ourselves that such explicative frameworks and procedures are peculiar to Finnegans Wake studies only because we choose as such to limit them. If we want to withdraw our consent to the linguistic and referential conventions in other cases, we can apply the same methods wherever we wish. Let us consider, for example, the first line of Mary Had a Little Lamb. Mary had a little lamb. If we assume that the words in this passage contain, let us say, anagrams of words in foreign languages, we may find that had read backwards gives Sanskrit dah, which means burn. The word is reversed. The reverse of burning is coldness. Mary is therefore to be thought of as frigid. Thus far, the outward excursion. Now follows the return to the plain sense, only a little heightened. That Mary is frigid explains her association with the little lamb and defines her identity more closely. A little lamb, the Lamb of God. Mary gave birth to, Christ. Both the Blessed Virgin Mary and Christ are, however, virginal, cold. This explication is, I suggest, entirely coherent. It is also very selective. Nothing indicates why we should read had in Sanskrit rather than, say, one of the Papuan languages. As before, the potential meanings are selected on the basis of their coherence with the plain English sense. So, right, we're sort of just using the most loose interpretive schema possible, where with this dispensing of value judgments in interpretation, if we want to accept the variety of possible perspectives, how do we justify any step in our interpretive schema? How do we justify reading Mary Had a Little Lamb as the most bare bones sense versus a political allegory versus this theological take that he sort of parodied here? He says, we must, I think, accept the fact that provided it is handled with sufficient ingenuity, good sense, even profound sense, can be derived from any reading taken at random from among the limitless semantic possibilities. Since, therefore, the possibilities are endless, it may seem more useful to work at the other end of the scale, to accept only so much meaning as is necessary to make some sense of every semantic unit, and where there are several possibilities, to accept only so much as establishes the most persuasive sense. So here, the criteria is firmly one of a pragmatic approach grounded in something like Occam's razor, where if you have two theories or two paradigms that explain, in this case, the black marks on the page to the same extent, then whichever one requires less steps, less assumptions, has less epistemic weight, and is therefore more of a justified pragmatic decision. As such, if we have a more persuasive interpretation that uses fewer steps than a more outlandish one, even if the outlandish one is interesting, Hart is saying that we should err on the side of simplicity here, which does not mean that what we reach is actually going to be simple. It just means it's the simplest of the complex explanations, which is basically a prerequisite for Finnegans Wake. Everything is going to be a complex explanation. Now, Hart is going to go even more meta by turning that pragmatic principle itself into a selectively chosen pragmatic principle. Let me elaborate. He goes through an interesting explication where he says that there are some passages where it seems that this approach is still not going to yield the best meaning. It will be so banal or so out of place that it doesn't seem to actually add anything meaningful. It does seem that the more complex explanation that is coherent, but is considerably more convoluted maybe, may actually be better. He says, as with all others associated with the exegesis of Finnegans Wake, it should be applied only when and if it provides the kind of answers that engender sudden insight, the aha reaction. Pragmatism is the basis of the world of the book, just as it is basis of Joyce's conceptual techniques, indeed of his whole practical philosophy of living. Too often one hears statements like, the word Joe is not yes, it is Hungarian for good. Such statements seem to me to be as constrictive and to show as little understanding of the function of literature as those which tell us once and for all what the word honey means in Yeats. And of course, this allusion is the Hungarian stuff is depending on the explication he's just been doing. But the point is that sometimes simplicity is not the best road. You just have to take it on a case-by-case basis and be willing to stretch this continuum of possible interpretive schemas to suit your means in this particular moment. Further down on and steer back there like the floor your daughters shake. Wasn't it the truth I told you? Lots of fun at Finnegans Wake. As such, Hart states, it seems that if we are to give any weight at all to Joyce's opinion about his work, the only satisfactory solution to the problem is to accept, in theory, all the possible meanings with which we have been dealing, but if possible, to arrange them in a hierarchy. Some are plainly more helpful than others, and in some cases, one reading is by so much the most illuminating that the others need hardly be considered. Let us retain all moods and senses as an aura of connotation, but in the present state of our understanding of Finnegans Wake, we would do well to confine most of our attention to what we tentatively identify as the kernel of meaning. And this is part of, for example, the hermeneutic circle, that you're kind of gradually increasing your understanding, your depth of understanding, at the same time widening your scope with regards to this text's connection to other things. And there is nevertheless a hierarchy of, this is more tentatively valuable, useful, integral than this one, but the hierarchy itself is prone to shifting. Just as you think of, for example, Thomas Kuhn's idea of paradigm shifts. In the same way, truth is a mobile thing, and within a given paradigm, we do have more or less plausible explanations, but the hierarchy itself is prone to shifting. The process whereby Finnegans Wake reached its final form was not unlike Gully Jimson's painting of the creation. It crumbled during the very moments of composition. While Joyce was elaborating successive drafts, his typists and printers were simultaneously corrupting and simplifying them. Joyce seems to have taken very little account of many of these corruptions, partly, no doubt, due to very poor eyesight, partly perhaps due to a genuine artistic principle leading him to incorporate fortuitous materials and thus release the book to some extent from the artist's control. And I think this is an important consideration when thinking about Finnegans Wake, because there does seem to be some understanding by Joyce, and there's even some self-commentary within the Wake, that he has to relinquish his control, that as an artist, he is not the entirety of what Finnegans Wake is. He's merely a receptacle of sorts. Hart says, quite apart from the critical questions raised by such a possibility, uncertainty as to the exact nature of the text often defeats any attempts to use consistency as the criterion of reading. As with some questions of modern physical theory, it is not that we could know but don't. It is rather that the information, the uncertainty that we are seeking, does not exist. And this is a reference, of course, to quantum mechanics, where we have Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which actually figures in the process of measurement. That measurement itself is a form of perturbation, and that as such, the subjectivity or the influence of the observer with the observed, first off, cannot be separated with one another. They are part of a synchronous movement together. As such, Hart writes, authorial irresponsibility, forgetfulness, lethargy, quirky laissez-faire, or a genuine desire to relinquish artistic control for an aesthetic purpose has thus led to a situation in which the rational methods of explication desired by Nathan Halper, and, so far as one can tell, by Jack Dalton, can be used to the full only when the heavy machinery of scholarship is applied to the manuscripts and proofs. And even then, a deal of doubt remains. A reading of the text produced by such scholarship is, of course, thoroughly artificial, taking as its text a book written by an ideal Joyce which never existed. What is the ordinary serious reader to do? We may postulate, as Robert Adams did for Ulysses, that the fractured surface is a part of the artwork rather than a flaw in it. Joyce's artistic methods, which include irresponsibility and the chat marche shrug, may not be attractive to all readers, but we need, I think, to take Finnegans Wake on its own terms. Sometimes the consistency of the text will lead to precise answers, separating the essential very clearly from the peripheral. Sometimes, on the other hand, no such precision is attainable, and we would do well to make what we can of the flux. And that's exactly it. There is no promise of resolution in Finnegans Wake. That is why it is anti-dialectical in many senses. It is opposed to Hegel's conception of history and of reality as fundamentally rational. Hegel says in The Philosophy of Right that the real is the rational and the rational is the real. Joyce fundamentally doubts that. In fact, he tries to inflect Finnegans Wake with all the non-rational, all the phantasmagoric, in a way that's going to lead sometimes to interesting thoughts and resolutions, and sometimes just to a confused daze, which may nevertheless be interesting for its own sake. Like the universe, Hart says, Finnegans Wake has weathered. As in descriptions of the universe, so with commentary on the book, we need to introduce a time factor. Some things that were once there are so no longer. Only an outline or an occasional fragment is left to witness to features which have been superseded. And as I suggested above, sometimes Joyce carried out the weathering process himself, while at other times he allowed it to happen outside of his control. I use this analogy because many critics argue, as Litz did, that muddied, for example, is still present in murried. I think, on the contrary, that it may no longer be there, and that there is no call to criticize Joyce adversely for having let it wear away. The outlines and fragments of past forms may hint at the way the world of Finnegans Wake used to look, but the reader will be doing the book more justice if he immerses himself in what is there now, including the old fragments, instead of trying to reconstruct past states. This is quite significant. There's been a lot of scholarship put into Finnegans Wake manuscripts and whatnot to try to find, the revised text and whatnot, because it's been famously known that Joyce didn't like the original Finnegans Wake when it was published in 1939. He had a list of 1,000 errata that he had to change. But one must remember that Finnegans Wake was being changed throughout the whole editorial and authorial process. It was never stable. Concepts were being, exchanged with him and his letters, between him and his friends and his patron. But at the same time, these concepts were kind of never really figured out in advance. They were being kind of chiseled away at. As such, I think Hart's essay is a really good kind of introduction for thinking about how to read Finnegans Wake, because it's honest about the very limitless capabilities in interpreting it. Next, we have the essay Reading Finnegans Wake by Louis O. Mink. And Mink mentions, for example, and this is a common thing that has been said about Finnegans Wake, that it emulates nature, that is nature in microcosm. He says, nature has no theories about itself. Neither does Finnegans Wake. Nor is nature a cipher of transcendent meaning, and no more is Finnegans Wake. And this is something that I think Joyce was so ahead of his time with. This is something that, in the realm of philosophy, is not really going to be cemented extremely rigorously. You kind of have it in Nietzsche, but really in Deleuze and Guattari, you get this focus on immanence, this full removal of the element of transcendence. And you do also get this in Heidegger, but it really becomes mainstream and really becomes thoroughly articulated in Deleuze and Guattari in the late 60s and early 70s and into the 80s. And this idea that nature is irreverent, that it does not care about us, is something that I think you have to wrestle with Finnegans Wake. It doesn't really care about you. It kind of toys with this understanding of the reader. There are constantly these moments where it will make you consciously aware that it itself is consciously aware of its difficulty, of its complex nature, of its idiosyncratic usage of plot and structure and language and whatnot. But Mink says that one of the fascinations of imaginative literature, I believe, and this may be the only definition of genius left to us, is the discovery that while no writer succeeds in saying as much as he intends, some succeed in saying more than they realize. Their work, so to speak, contains answers to questions which they never entertained and which we have not yet learned to ask. And that's one of the most profound things about Finnegans Wake, is that it is so open to the future. It is so clear that even though you have the text in front of you, it is very profoundly changing and unstable. Every successive iteration through scholarship and through the reading of even the most casual reader changes the text. And as such, Mink says that Finnegans Wake is a nihilistic text. And he says that, okay, when I say nihilism, I mean that in a world where everything has equal value, for example, this de-hierarchized hermeneutic schema we've been talking about, and importance with everything else, nothing has any value or importance in itself, since the concept of value is essentially comparative and a function of some relative scale. One can read Finnegans Wake as the supreme expression of the cosmic impulse, in which greatness is diminished to the mundane. Or one can read it as the perfection of the lyric vision, for which a feather, a pebble, or an earlobe can be uniquely celebrated and elevated to a totally preoccupying object of consciousness, something which, at least while the vision lasts, cannot be exceeded by any grandeur or sublimity. Each of these ways is legitimate if we forget the other, but taken together, the cosmic impulse and the lyric vision add up to a kind of nihilism I have tried to characterize, and Finnegans Wake is the supreme and possibly the only example of this formula. And this is part of the sort of juxtaposition of the profane and the sublime at the same time, the dirtiest aspects of human nature, such as this primordial sin that's being talked about, the crime of HCE, sexual impotence, shit in the literal sense. These can both be burgeoned into the ground and also celebrated as something ecstatic in and of themselves. As such, Mink writes that in Finnegans Wake, on the other hand, there are levels and always more levels, but no correspondence between levels of meaning and levels of importance. In other words, there is a sort of consistency to each milieu in itself, which is not self-sufficient insofar as it is contextualized by other milieus, but it has an internal logic such that interpretation and meaning and significance can be understood internal to that milieu. This is something that Deleuze and Guattari talk about. Earwicker's voyeurism in Phoenix Park is no more a symbol for the original sin of Adam than the other way around. But on the other hand, Earwicker is no less important for being Adam, and the father of us all, as he is, than for being the proprietor of the Mullinger pub in the Dublin suburb of Chapelizod. In the world of Finnegans Wake, everything and everyone metamorphoses continually into everything and everyone else. Even male and female are interchangeable, and therefore nothing has its own inviolable nature and value. Hence, there is adumbrated a nihilist cosmology, which could not, I think, be stated as a coherent philosophical theory, or given expression in any literary or artistic form other than the unique word world of Joyce's artifice. And this is profoundly Deleuzian, right? We have these kind of geographic layers, these strata, which have a consistency of their own, but which are always interpenetrating and moving, ever dynamic. And that dynamism inherent into the project kind of prohibits any genuinely systematic theory. We merely move into a sort of pragmatic way of coming up with heuristics, coming up with ways of contextualization and relativization that are going to help us make sense of things as they arise. And I think that's one of the really profound things that's said in Mink's essay. Next we have The Peculiar Language of Finnegans Wake by Derek Attridge. And this is really cool because Attridge focuses on the portmanteau word, which is the combining of various words and their meanings together in order to form a new word. It's similar to a neologism, but it contains more of the remnants of the words from which it came. For example, smog is smoke and fog put together, or motel is motor and hotel put together. Attridge states, "There is no escape from its insistence that meaning is an effect of language, not a presence within or behind it, and that the effect is unstable and uncontrollable. Notice, too, that whereas the pun can easily be contained by being treated as the index of an imperfect language, allowing ambiguity where it should insist on univocity, The conclusion is harder to escape than the portmanteau can be nothing other than a defining feature of language itself, because the portmanteau derives from the fact that the same segments, letters, phonemes, syllables, can be combined in different ways to encode different meanings. A language in which portmanteau formulations were impossible would be a language in which every signified was matched with a unique and unanalyzable signifier. That is not a language at all. And that's profoundly important. That's one of the things that Joyce is really trying to focus on in terms of his ideas of linguistics, is that this splintering in language is a function of language at every moment in time. For example, some people who kind of know that English has not always existed as it has. It's gone from, Old English / Anglo-Saxon to Middle English, Middle High English, Early Modern English, and now Modern English. They might be like, oh, well, today's English is stable. But if you ask a linguist, language is really never stable. In fact, linguists don't really have a definition of a language. What's the difference between a language and a dialect? What's the difference between a dialect and an idiolect? In a sense, every language is an idiolect. And the idea of a language itself is just an abstraction taken from the averaging out of various idiolects. So in the same way, the use of the portmanteau word shows the variety of associations inherent in language itself that makes it able to do its job. He says that the portmanteau word, far from being a sport, an eccentricity, a mistake, is a revelation of the processes upon which all language relies. The same relation obtains between Finnegans Wake and the tradition of the novel. That which appears to be a limiting case or a parody, a parasite on the healthy body of literature, is at the same time central and implicated in the way the most normal text operates. So what Finnegans Wake is trying to do is getting us to appreciate that language always acts like this. We just don't notice it most of the time. He focuses on this word shuit, S-H-U-I-T. And he says, okay, what do we make of this? To call it a word is, of course, misleading. It is precisely because it is not a word recognized as belonging to the English language that it functions as it does, preventing the immediate move from material signifier to conceptual signified. Unlike the pun, which exists only if the context brings it into being, the portmanteau refuses by itself any single meaning, and in reading we therefore have to nudge it towards other signifiers whose meanings might prove appropriate. And this aha moment will happen when you have a pun, where it's very clear what it's trying to do, and it's almost funny because of that. But the portmanteau word, if you think about the fact that a portmanteau word had to be invented at some point, and people had to get used to what it is, like they do with slang today, and this is assisted by things like TikTok, for example, that makes it really easy to learn new slang. But someone has to learn it at some point, and that first, I think of these TikToks of these like middle school teachers learning all the new slang words, and they're like trying to learn the new lingo, and there's so many and they're so varied. The meaning can often be completely impenetrable, such that you'll have these videos of these these Gen Zers that you can't even figure out what they're saying with the level of complexity of their neologisms and maybe even portmanteau words and whatnot. He says, shuit works more powerfully because it insists on a productive act of reading, because its effects are simultaneous, and because the result is an expansion of meaning much more extensive than that affected by the pun. The pun carries a powerful charge of satisfaction. The specter of a potentially unruly and unlimited infinite language is raised only to be exercised. The writer and the reader are still firmly in control, and the language has been made to seem even more orderly and appropriate than we had realized, because an apparently arbitrary coincidence in its system has been shown to be capable of semantic justification. But shuit and its kind are more disturbing. The portmanteau has the effect of a failed pun. The patterns of language have been shown to be partially appropriate, but with a residue of difference where the pun found only happy similarity. And that's one of the things that's really profoundly important about reading Finnegans Wake, is being firmly committed to not knowing, to accepting the uncomfortability of meeting something genuinely new. Because oftentimes we'll get that through style, but only rarely do we get that in language itself. Oftentimes, those linguophiles who like to go out and listen to new languages just for the heck of it, like myself, this is a more fairly common occurrence. But even then, to experience it exactly as Wakeys does it is not common at all. As such, he says, can we have boundaries with regards to portmanteau words? And he says, the answer to this question may seem straightforward. Like the pun, the portmanteau will contain as much as the verbal context permits it to contain, and no more. But the answer brings us to a fundamental point about the Wake, because the context itself is made up of puns and portmanteau. So far as I have spoken as if the context were a given, a firm structure of meaning which has one neatly defined whole in it. But this notion is, of course, pure interpretive fiction. The text is a web of shifting meanings, and every new interpretation of one item recreates afresh the context of all the other items. Having found suit in schwit, for example, one can reinterpret the previous word to yield the phrase birthday suit as a colloquial expression for nakedness, nicely epitomizing the fusion of the states of being clothed and unclothed which the passage implies. One more example of the denial of the logic of opposites which starts to characterize this text with its very title. Thus, a contextual circle is created, whereby plurality of meaning in one item increases the availability of meanings of other items, which in turn increase the possibilities of meaning in the original item. This is that expansion of the hermeneutic circle. The longer and denser the text, the more often the circle will revolve, and the greater will be the proliferation of meanings. It is important to note, however, that the network of signification remains systematic. And he has a very particular meaning in mind with systematic, not as in like systematic philosophy. The familiar accusation that there is no way of denying the relevance of any meaning any commentator cares to find, to quote Goldberg again, is without substance. In a text as long and as densely worked as Finnegans Wake, however, the systematic networks of meaning could probably provide context for most of the associations that individual words might evoke, though an individual reader could not be expected to grasp them all. This sense of a spiraling increase in potential meaning is one of the grounds on which the Wake is left unread. But is this not an indication of the way that all texts operate? Every item in a text functions simultaneously as a sign whose meaning is limited, but not wholly limited, by its context, and as a context limiting but not wholly limiting the meanings of other signs. There is no escape from this circle, no privileged item that yields its meaning apart from the system in which it is perceived and which can act as a contextless concept or transcendental fixing point to anchor the whole text. The enormous difference between Finnegans Wake and other literary works is perhaps a difference in degree, not in kind. And that's super important. We are denying a metaphysical, self-sufficient, transcendental signifier, which stands above and grounds our hermeneutic project. Instead, we are accepting the perspectival nature of paradigms and the variation and contingency of the logic within those paradigms. On the notion of the portmanteau, he says that it shatters any illusion that the systems of difference in language are fixed and sharply drawn, reminding us that signifiers are perpetually dissolving into one another. In the never-ending diachronic development of language, in the blurred edges between languages, dialects, registers, idiolects, in the interchange between speech and writing, in errors and misunderstandings, unfortunate or fruitful, in riddles, jokes, games, and dreams. Finnegans Wake insists that the strict boundaries and discrete elements in a linguist's grammar of competence are a Neoplatonic illusion. But the portmanteau problematizes even the most stable signifier by showing how its relations to other signifiers can be productive. We find that we can quite easily relate suit to shirt, just as we do in fact relate suit to suits or suited. Instead of saying that in learning a language we learn to ascribe meaning to a few of the many patterns of sound we perceive, it may be as true to say that we learn not to ascribe meaning to most of those connections, until we are allowed to do so again to a certain degree in rhetoric and poetry, and which almost completely abandons itself in Finnegans Wake. And this is important. Finnegans Wake only takes the fetters off your everyday language. And the creation happens from realizing that the fetters were there all along. The result, of course, is that as we read the Wake, we test for their possible associations not only the obvious portmanteau, but every apparently normal word as well. The phrase bangled ears does not present itself as a portmanteau, and in most cases it would be read as a somewhat odd but semantically specific conjunction of adjective and noun. But the context of the Wake's portmanteau style encourages us, as I have suggested, to hear it also as bandolier, to combine the attributes of the savage or stranger with those of the soldier. Even the most normal and innocent word will invite such treatment. The implications of the portmanteau word, or rather the portmanteau text, go further, however. The portmanteau undermines the notion of authorial intention, for instance, in a way quite foreign to the traditional pun. The pun, in fact, strengthens the illusion of intention as a presence within the text. The careful construction of context to allow both meanings equal force and to exclude all other meanings is not something that happens by accident, we feel. And this feeling makes the pun acceptable in certain literary environments because there is no danger that the coincidence thus exposed will enable language to wrest control from its users. But the portmanteau word, though its initial effect is often similar, has a habit of refusing to rest with that comforting sensation of I see what the author meant. And that's one of the interesting things about Finnegans Wake is, should you interpret it as this is probably what Joyce had in mind, or should you expect the linguistic splintering, the textual splintering itself, that splinters are the text itself, and that Joyce would be fine with you coming up with new meanings? He says, and why should any particular number of associations in any particular number of languages correspond to the author's intention? Joyce has set in motion a process over which he has no final control. And that's something really mature about Joyce here, is he recognizes that he's not going to control this. Similarly, Attridge says, the portmanteau word leaves few of the conventional assumptions about narrative intact. Récit cannot be separated from histoire when it surfaces in the texture of the words themselves. When, for instance, the story of Buckley and the Russian general is woven, by the portmanteau method, into a statement of new clothing, it is impossible to talk in terms of the narration of a supposedly prior event. Rather, there is a process of fusion which enforces the realization that all stories are textual effects. Characters, too, are never behind the text in Finnegans Wake, but in it. ALP, HCE, Buckley, and the Russian general have their being in portmanteau words, in acrostics, in shapes on the page, though this too is only a reinforcement of the status of all fictional characters. Every word in every text is, after all, a portmanteau of sorts, a combination of sounds that echo through the entire language and through every other language, and back through the history of speech. Finnegans Wake makes us aware that we, as readers, control this explosion, allowing only those connections to be affected which will give us the kinds of meanings we recognize. And I actually disagree with him here on the notion that we control this. We don't control what jumps out at us. That's the profoundly enjoyable thing about Finnegans Wake, is getting rid of this idea of intentionalistic reading. It's like that fourth approach that was mentioned earlier, where we focus on onomatopoeia and totem words and just the affective experience of receptivity. So he says that Finnegans Wake makes us aware that we will control this explosion, allowing only those connections to be affected, which will give us the kinds of meanings we recognize, Stories, voices, characters, metaphors, images, beginnings, developments, ends, morals, truths. We do not, of course, control it as a matter of choice, and I'm glad he said that. We are subject to the various grids that make literature and language possible at all. Rules, habits, conventions, and all the boundaries that legitimate and exclude in order to produce meanings and values themselves rooted in the ideology of our place and time. Nevertheless, to obtain a glimpse of the infinite possibility of meaning kept at bay by those grids, to gain a sense that the boundaries upon which our language depends are set up under specific historical conditions, is to be made aware of a universe more open to reinterpretation and change than the one we are usually conscious of inhabiting. And this is profoundly reminiscent of a lot of postmodern theorists in their understanding of meaning and of identity itself, of the inherent value of difference and splintering, that there is no behind, that there is only a process of local receptivity, realization, affectation, and whatnot. And finally, we have the fourth essay, Finnegans Wake and the Nature of Narrative, by Michael H. Begnal. And this is really interesting because what Begnal argues here is that there actually is plot or narrative in Finnegans Wake. It's just a different kind than we would expect. And this is something that is very tricky when reading Finnegans Wake, is I vacillate back and forth between, does anything actually happen in Finnegans Wake or not? Obviously, it's a dream, right? It's his night book. So in some senses, nothing is happening in reality. It's all just a series of images, ideas. But of course, it carries political, religious, historical significance. And as such, it's important to determine to what extent plot is important in Finnegans Wake. And Begnal says that some recent studies assert that there is no plot in Finnegans Wake, or if there is, it's so amorphous or treated so scantily that it cannot be perceived in any conventional fashion. HCE becomes, quote, a goal, a thing sought, a retort to the enigma of creation. And all events in the wake are merely stories, and it is impossible to determine whether they represent history or fiction. Only by abandoning the novelistic approach to Finnegans Wake can readers free themselves from waking conventions and logic enough to enjoy the wholly imaginative reality of a dream work. These are all various quotes from scholars, and he actually wants to push back on this a little bit. Begnal wants to say that there is a plot, we just have to think about plot very differently. He says, there is some kind of story being told here, though it's being told at least 5 different ways at the same time. And he's referring to a specific example here. I'm just not bringing it to your attention. Where a conventional novelist would be concerned with the result of the plot, Joyce focuses on the potentiality of plot and characterization as they unfold on many levels at once. This is why Begnal will focus on the vertical aspect of plot instead of the horizontal. Instead of development through time and history in a linear way, it's the juxtaposition of perspectives on top of each other, which is what Nietzsche tries to do. As Mamalujo reminds Sean, there are sordidly tales within tales. You clearly understand that? The events or the levels of Finnegans Wake are not connected causally, but they are controlled novelistically. They are not psychoanalytic free associations, but are distorted mirror reflections of each other. In other words, they are both the same and different, depending on the respect in which you want to approach it. They hearken to each other, but they also create depth through their separation, through their irremediable difference. All these plot levels are controlled, Begnal says, and in this new sense, plot functions essentially as exposition of character, deriving from possibility rather than essentially from logicality or necessity. If HCE, for example, can best be understood as a concept, a sigla, as Roland McHugh has asserted, then these overlaid simultaneous plot levels in the wake serve to present the E, which is the sigla for HCE, in potential rather than in actuality. As the narrator describes his manipulations of HCE and ALP, he will, quote, guide them through the labyrinth of their same-alikes and altogether goesses of their pseudo-selves. And so the initial difficulty arises in the wake when the reader tries to splice all these plot levels together in a horizontal rather than a vertical way. If once these levels can be isolated, traced to their individual conclusions or non-conclusions, and then wrapped cable-like together, the design of the narrative becomes clearer, as do our conceptions of the characters. An examination of the multiple reports or descriptions of the sin in the park will never allow a reader to pick a correct one, but will instead, when all are taken together, enlarge our perception of Wakean sin and guilt. Right or wrong-headedly, Joyce feels that a single conventional narrative level would limit the artist's freedom of action, and this is his alternative to the go-ahead plot. And that's important, right? That we're never getting a final say on truth, but we are getting the successive elaboration of a concept and actually seeing the contingency of that concept as it is created and destroyed. In Finnegans Wake, Begnal continues, age, like time, is fluid, can be telescoped, and characters reveal themselves to us from many different points of view at the same time. Joyce is not interested here in time as development, as in a Bildungsroman, but rather he examines time as immediate and simultaneous. As Marcel Bryan commented, he creates his own time as he creates his vocabulary in his characters. He soon elaborates what he receives from reality by a mysterious chemistry into new elements bearing the marks of this personality. The macrocosm and the microcosm are one, just as the various potentialities of each member of the Earwicker family form a unity. To paraphrase Beckett, the novel is not about the characters, it is the characters themselves. And that's the profoundly empathetic realm of Finnegans Wake. That it's not about characters from the outside, but it is a genuine occupation of their universe, of an exploration of something completely unknown in the depths of someone's mind. So that being said, I know this is very long, but I hope that some of these essays have been helpful in terms of thinking about Finnegans Wake. This is a great kind of collection to get. It's edited by Patrick A. McCarthy, and I think it's a really useful thing for getting such a variety of scholarly perspectives. You can get more or less conservative approaches to hermeneutics and meaning and language and whatnot, and this all just provides very interesting food for thought. So that being said, that's it for this video. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can make as you want. I also have super thanks available if you just want to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd really appreciate anything you have to give, but no worries. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.